Wars rarely end the way they begin. They don't conclude with a single explosion. They don't stop the moment soldiers stop firing. They end quietly, with signatures, with announcements, with carefully chosen words, and sometimes with silence. In this scenario, the war in Ukraine does not freeze into a stalemate. It does not collapse into internal revolution. It does not expand into global nuclear exchange. Instead, Russia wins, not necessarily through total conquest of all Ukrainian territory, but through strategic dominance. Kyiv falls under a negotiated settlement favorable to Moscow. Western military aid slows. Sanctions fracture. A ceasefire agreement formalizes new borders. The headlines are cautious. Peace agreement reached. Conflict ends after years of war. New security framework announced. But beneath those diplomatic phrases lies something much larger, a shift in global power. Because when a major power wins a modern war against a Western-backed coalition, the consequences ripple far beyond the battlefield. This is not about celebration. This is about consequences. The first 30 days after Russia's victory would not feel dramatic. They would feel tense. NATO leaders would hold emergency meetings behind closed doors. European governments would reassure their populations. Washington would frame the outcome as a strategic recalibration. But internally, the calculation would be different. Russia would have demonstrated something critical, that Western deterrence can fail, that sustained sanctions do not necessarily collapse a regime, that prolonged military support does not guarantee victory, and in geopolitics, perception matters as much as reality. Within weeks, 3 immediate shifts would begin. First, Eastern Europe would feel exposed. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania would push for increased NATO deployments. Defense spending would surge across the continent, not because Russia would immediately invade elsewhere, but because uncertainty is destabilizing. Second, NATO cohesion would quietly strain, not publicly. Public unity would remain strong, but behind the scenes, questions would emerge. How far should Article 5 commitments extend? How sustainable is long-term military engagement? What is the political cost of future conflicts? Third, China would be watching closely, because a Russian victory would not simply be a regional event. It would be a test case. If Moscow withstands sanctions, absorbs economic isolation, and emerges with territorial gains, Beijing recalculates its own risk thresholds. Taiwan becomes part of the conversation, not as an immediate target, but as a long-term scenario. Global markets would react cautiously. Energy prices might stabilize if Russian exports resume under new arrangements. European economies might seek gradual normalization, but the deeper shift would not be economic. It would be psychological. The idea of a rules-based international order would weaken. For decades, the post-Cold War system operated on assumptions. Borders should not change by force. Major wars in Europe are relics of history. Economic interdependence deters aggression. A Russian victory would challenge those assumptions, not eliminate them, but erode them. In Moscow, the messaging would be deliberate. The Kremlin would frame the outcome as proof of resilience. Proof that Western pressure cannot dictate Russia's destiny. Proof that multipolarity, a world without a single dominant superpower, is already here. And domestically, that narrative would matter. It would reinforce regime stability. It would strengthen the argument that endurance wins over sanctions. But what happens next is not immediate expansion. It is consolidation. Russia would likely focus on securing gains, stabilizing occupied regions, and negotiating long-term economic arrangements with non-Western partners. The bigger transformation would occur in global alignments. Countries that have remained neutral, India, parts of Africa, segments of the Middle East, would interpret the outcome pragmatically. They would not view it through ideological lenses. They would view it through power. If Russia wins despite isolation, then Russia remains a durable pole in the international system. That affects trade agreements, military procurement, energy strategy. The world does not suddenly fracture into chaos, it slowly reorganizes. Meanwhile, in Washington, strategy would shift. The United States would not collapse. It would not retreat entirely, but it would reassess. More resources might pivot toward the Indo-Pacific. European defense responsibilities would increase. Domestic political divisions over foreign policy would deepen. Because a lost proxy war, even indirectly, reshapes public opinion. Questions would arise: should the U.S. have been more involved or less? Was escalation avoided wisely, or was deterrence insufficient? These debates would not be abstract. They would shape elections, budgets, military doctrine. In Europe, the consequences would feel closer. Ukraine, under a settlement favorable to Russia, would face internal instability. Refugee flows might continue. Economic recovery would be uneven. Political polarization would intensify. Some European nations would push for rapid integration of remaining Ukrainian territories into Western institutions. Others would advocate caution. The European Union itself would feel pressure. Energy diversification would accelerate, not because Russia disappears, but because dependency becomes politically risky. At the same time, some European states might quietly reopen channels with Moscow, not out of trust, but out of necessity. This is how global orders shift, not through dramatic announcements, through incremental adjustments, trade deals, security pacts, defense budgets, diplomatic visits. Now, consider the military dimension. A Russian victory would influence military doctrine worldwide. It would validate the use of attrition warfare in modern conflicts. It would reinforce the importance of industrial capacity over rapid maneuver. Armies across the globe would study the conflict not for ideology, but for lessons: drone warfare, electronic warfare, artillery production, logistics endurance. Defense industries would surge. NATO countries would expand manufacturing capacity. Asia-Pacific nations would reassess stockpiles. The era of small, limited wars would feel less certain. The assumption that high-intensity conflict is improbable would weaken. And in global diplomacy, language would change. The term multipolar world would become mainstream. Because Russia winning does not mean Russia dominates the globe. It means power is more evenly contested. And contested systems are less predictable. By the end of the first year after victory, the world would not look destroyed. It would look cautious. Investments would shift toward defense. Alliances would tighten selectively. Neutral nations would hedge. The United Nations would continue functioning. Global trade would continue. Flights would still take off and land. But beneath the surface, the confidence of the previous era would be gone. The belief that the post-1991 order was permanent would fade. And once belief fades in geopolitics, behavior changes. The new global order would not be built overnight. It would emerge slowly, through perception, through recalculation, through leaders asking a single question. If Russia could win there, where else might the balance shift? And that question alone reshapes the future. If Russia wins, the first year is not about expansion. It is about consolidation. Moscow's immediate priority would not be new offensives, but stabilization. Politically, militarily, economically. Victory in a prolonged war is expensive. Even a successful campaign leaves behind logistical strain, economic pressure, and internal fatigue. So, year one becomes a year of normalization. State media in Russia would frame the outcome as proof of endurance, that resilience defeats pressure, that sovereignty resists containment. Domestic support for the leadership would likely rise in the short term. In geopolitical terms, that matters. Because regimes that win wars tend to consolidate internally. Opposition voices weaken, security services strengthen. The narrative of external threat remains useful, but now reinforced by triumph. Meanwhile, in Europe, the psychological map shifts. For decades, European security policy was built on two assumptions. First, that large-scale land war in Europe was a relic of history. Second, that NATO's deterrence umbrella was unquestioned, A Russian victory challenges both, not by dissolving NATO, but by redefining its urgency. Defense budgets across Europe would continue rising sharply. Germany's rearmament efforts would accelerate. Poland would double down on military expansion. The Baltic states would push for permanent NATO basing. But here's the paradox. The stronger NATO becomes militarily, the more the continent militarizes politically. Europe would enter a new era of strategic anxiety. Borders become more sensitive. Airspace violations trigger sharper reactions. Military exercises increase in frequency. The continent becomes stable, but tense. And tension changes behavior. Now look east. China's position in a post-war world becomes critical. Beijing would interpret a Russian victory not as an invitation to immediate action, but as a case study. The lessons would not be emotional. They would be strategic. How effective were sanctions? How sustainable was industrial output under isolation? How did Western public opinion shift over time? Taiwan policy would not change overnight, but Chinese military planning would incorporate new assumptions. That economic pressure does not automatically collapse a determined state. That prolonged conflict reshapes alliances. That Western unity can be tested over time. The Indo-Pacific would grow more volatile, not through war, but through signaling. Naval deployments increase. Joint drills intensify. Strategic ambiguity narrows. And across Asia, nations like Japan, South Korea, and Australia would expand defense cooperation further. Multipolarity does not mean chaos. It means competition spreads. In the Middle East, the recalibration would be more subtle. Countries like Iran would view a Russian victory as validation of resistance against Western pressure. Gulf states, meanwhile, would hedge carefully. They would not abandon Washington, but they would diversify security relationships. Arms deals become more varied. Energy agreements become more flexible. The era of exclusive alignment fades. In Africa and Latin America, the narrative shifts towards sovereignty. The argument that Western sanctions can isolate a power indefinitely loses some credibility. Non-aligned nations may deepen ties with multiple blocs simultaneously, not out of ideology, out of leverage. The world begins to look less binary. Now, consider global economics. Sanctions regimes do not simply disappear after victory. They evolve. Some restrictions might ease over time. Others become permanent. Parallel financial systems expand. Alternative payment networks grow. Trade flows reorganize around political alignment. Energy markets fragment further. Europe accelerates diversification permanently. Russia deepens energy ties eastward. China increases leverage as a mediator of trade between blocs. The global economy does not collapse. It regionalizes, supply chains shorten, strategic industries reshore, critical minerals become geopolitical assets. Defense industries in particular experience sustained growth. Because if one major conflict can be won through attrition and industrial endurance, every power invests accordingly. Military manufacturing ceases to be a secondary sector. It becomes central to strategic planning. And here is where the deeper shift occurs. The post-Cold War era was defined by globalization as destiny. The post-Ukraine era, if Russia wins, would redefine globalization as conditional. Trade is no longer assumed permanent. Partnerships are no longer assumed stable. Interdependence becomes strategic rather than automatic. Now, fast forward 5 years. The map of Europe would not necessarily look dramatically different beyond the formalized settlement, but the atmosphere would. Air defense systems would line eastern borders. Cyber defense would become a national priority everywhere. Energy infrastructure would be hardened, and trust would be thinner. Diplomacy would still function. Summits would still occur. But the underlying belief in a universally shared order would be weaker. The concept of rules-based order would coexist with sphere of influence logic. In Washington, strategic doctrine would evolve. The United States would likely pivot more heavily toward China containment. European allies would carry greater regional responsibility. Domestic debates over foreign entanglements would intensify. Isolationist voices might grow louder, not because the US is defeated globally, but because strategic prioritization becomes unavoidable. And here lies the most important consequence. A Russian victory would not produce immediate global war. It would produce a world of sharper edges, a world where deterrence is tested more often, where gray zone tactics, cyber attacks, proxy conflicts, political interference become normalized tools. Full-scale war might remain rare, but hybrid conflict would expand. Information warfare intensifies. Election interference allegations multiply. Cyber disruptions become routine. The battlefield moves partially online. Now, consider internal Russian strategy. Would Moscow attempt further expansion? Not necessarily immediately. Wars exhaust economies, even victorious ones. More likely, Russia would pursue influence over overt territorial conquest. Political leverage in neighboring states, energy diplomacy, security agreements that widen its buffer zone. Influence is cheaper than occupation, and in a world already recalibrating, influence may be enough. But the risk lies in miscalculation. When multiple powers feel emboldened, the margin for error shrinks. A naval incident in the Baltic, a confrontation in the South China Sea, a cyber attack misattributed. In a stable unipolar world, crises are often de-escalated through dominant mediation. In a multipolar world, de-escalation requires negotiation between equals, and equals do not always trust each other. That is the structural shift, not domination, not apocalypse, but equilibrium under tension. The new global order would not belong solely to Russia. It would not belong solely to the United States. It would be contested space, a system where influence is negotiated constantly, where power balances shift incrementally, where alliances are transactional rather than permanent, and ordinary life would continue. Markets would open each morning, flights would depart, cities would grow, but beneath daily routine, strategic competition would hum quietly. The illusion of permanence would be gone, and perhaps that is the deepest transformation. For 30 years, many believed that large-scale power shifts were behind us. That history had stabilized. A Russian victory would remind the world that history does not end. It pauses, then resumes. And in this resumed era, every state recalculates. Every alliance reassesses. Every leader asks, what does power really mean now? The answer would not be written in a single treaty. It would unfold over years, in budgets, in deployments, in energy routes, in new diplomatic alignments. This is what a Russian victory would change. Not the sky, not the planet, but the architecture of global power. And once that architecture shifts, the future never returns to what it was.